20 years now. Started working on Coeur d'Alene back in 2008. Been a while. I don't work on as much as I did in the past. I help with conceptual site model. Some work in the upper basin, but mostly in borders. Do a lot of like dam restoration or dam removal, remediation sites, and transport.
We can't hear online with them.
And
So you have to use the microphone.
Stabilization.
You see that? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
They normally, when I give these talks, like some of these things have disappeared. These are topics. It's very site specific. We have information. We're talking about a specific location. To my knowledge, it's a little more broad. So it's going to be a little higher level today. We'll talk first a little bit about just kind of like principal approaches on how you might go about selecting river bank treatments, goals, constraints. That's one of the things that I think often gets neglected a little bit. It's talking about constraints.
Am I speaking in the microphone?
Oh, we got online people.
Yeah.
That's the, they can't hear you.
I didn't know.
Okay, my.
All right, we'll just switch this. Is that better?
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, let me know if people can't hear. Going through the topics again here. Yeah, design criteria is something I think often gets neglected early on in the project, have some things go wrong. Not spend enough time on that, and then we'll go through stable material selection and go through a couple of treatment options. We're going to focus on just a couple that I have heard being discussed. We have vegetated riprap, things like Cussel. And backwater design conditions, lower basin obviously has a lake effect. Talked about some of the issues designing systems and backwater, and some issues with vegetation and constructability. And there'll be a little bit of time left at the end for discussion. So jump right in. Typical design approach, starting off with goals, constraints, design criteria. This starting with this really helps like reduce the options. Once you spend the time on setting up your design criteria, it really helps filter down what's available options. So spending time there really helps with getting to the end result that you want. If you don't spend enough time there, you can end up with projects that aren't what you ultimately wanted. A typical approach would be alternatives analysis. This can be very different scales. It could just be cartoon sketches, or it could be very elaborate where you're modeling everything in detail. So typically, it's just identify a few candidates. Most sites know that there's a couple sites, treatments that they're considering. Also, typically you have like rough order of magnitude, construction cost is usually what you these. Going through this process at the end, you usually want to see if there's any questions that are unanswered. You know, you might not evaluate things all the way through. So identify those remaining data gaps or knowledge gaps that you have. And then at the end, you're usually picking one to advance, go further. I got optional number 3 there. Multiple treatments. So when you're talking about selecting different treatments, you don't always have to pick one. I use multiple treatments that you're going to pick. And I'll give some examples of that as we go through. All right, going back to goals, constraints, design criteria. Goals would be, you know, what do measures of success, measures of failure? Typically, those would be like design life or what kind of floods you want this to withstand. I mean, it's not going to be, they're not going to build something that's going to withstand a 500-year, 1,000-year flood. So you need to think about balancing costs and what this design floods would be purchased because some. And then constraints, a lot of the physical property boundaries, if there's infrastructure, roads, bridges, you know, mapping all that stuff out to know what your constraints are on the site, what's available disposal space. Cost is usually constrained, should be thought about early. Availability of materials should be thought about early. There'll be things like, especially if you're using like large rock, wood, cuttings, those kinds of things. Make sure they're available in the area. You don't want to be hauling source material from hundreds of miles away. Permitting also can be a constraint, especially things like FEMA floodplains, regulatory floodplains, no rise, those sort of things. Be a constraint. Those constraints are usually design criteria as well. But design criteria includes more than just the constraints. So, avoiding adverse impacts downstream, adjacent banks, that sort of thing. This is usually put together in a table, and I have an example on the next slide here, but let's just jump to the example there. Permitting requirements, habitat goals, if you have habitat goals, those could be design criteria. Materials, like I had on the last one, you could have, sometimes there's preferred materials or materials that are to be avoided. So just identify those in the design criteria table. This is an example. This would have to be multiple pages long. I just put together a generic one here as an example. So you got your design criteria on the left. So one might be stability factors. So obviously you want it strong enough it's not going to fail. And a lot of these have a design discharge associated with them. So for example, there in the 100-year, you could have multiple. There could be, maybe you want to have factor safety 1.5 for the 50-year event, but for the 100-year event, you just want a 1.0. It could be multiple different, you don't want to completely collapse in a catastrophic flood. You don't want to design it so much that it's very expensive and complex and over-designed. This table, if this was an alternatives analysis, you could have multiple alternatives across here to compare and contrast the different options. And usually there's some sort of comment criteria there. You don't just yes or no. A lot of these are a little more nuanced, so you can have some discussion outside of some of these things, or maybe it wasn't evaluated at this level. Other things on that table would be, we talked about earlier, material availability. You gotta make sure you have materials. The impacts on water surface elevations don't increase flooding. This is just a bunch of examples. Recreation I put on there is another one. Access. So if you're thinking about if there's anglers, if there's boaters, if you're designing something that's just chock full of vegetation on both sides, how is the public access to the water? Especially if they're common fishing areas, or if there's a lot of boaters that need places to get regress from the river. So it's something to think about, make sure not just creating a corridor where there's no access to the river in certain locations. Again, I don't know exact site. Something to think about, especially if you're near, public spaces where there's a lot of interaction with the river. And then there could be a variety of construction considerations, complexity, cost is obviously there, access, those sort of things you can put into that design criteria table. This really helps just filter down. If you go through this process, helps you get to a selection of bank treatment. The more time and effort you put in this, I think the better end result you get. Sometimes this is, I think, overlooked or just neglected. This is more like semantics a little bit. I'm not gonna spend so much time on it, but we're talking about what I call bank treatments, would be a combination of materials that, different materials on the surface, or flat vegetation, fabrics, wood, whatever it may be, and then combined with the bank geometry. So I would call that a bank treatment. It's a combination of materials and geometry. If you have uniform slopes, you have benches, a little floodplain bench, or just called variable slope. Maybe you want a steeper slope at the bottom before it tapers off in more floodplain. So when I say bank treatments, I'm talking about a combination of these. All right, this is a XY plot is showing it's obviously not quantitative, but on the x-axis you got soft or green treatments. All the way to the far right would be like hard gray, more of your rock or graph. And then on the y-axis you basically got the strength or resistance to erosion. So lower left would just be a basic erosion control blanket with planting. So grass or plants, it's very green. There's no rock, there's no hard materials, but it's not very strong. And then upper right would be, basically stone, concrete, any of those types of things. Upper left is fabric encapsulated soil mist. So I'll use the term vessel for those. We'll talk about those more later. So very strong, also, they're on the green side. We also have benching in there where that's just by, so it's a cut bank that looks similar to a lot of stuff in the lower basin. But even just by removing that cut bank and laying the slope back, you're getting a lot of lowering of velocity and shear stress on that thing just by excavating that out. So obviously you plant or something on that too, but well, paying attention there just because it's by opening it up, you're reducing the force on that, and you're also increasing the stability of that thing by laying it back. I can go through all of these. You got vegetated riprap sort of in the middle. Woody debris, that's probably not appropriate for the lower base, and then using higher order experience. But there's deeper gradients. Selection of stable materials. So there's a lot of guidelines out there. Most agencies have their own. They're fairly redundant. A lot of them are using the same sources, references. They point back to the same research in a lot of cases, but there are some nuances and some of them cover different tank treatments better than others or more specific. You know, the highway stuff will be more riprap, whereas if your reclamation might be doing a little more bioengineering type work. So, you know, I think this early on, it's good to pick which design guidance you're wanting to use for the project, and it might be multiple. But they're out there. I'll go through just a couple of them. Some of the more common ones. This is called Fishnick. It's by the Army Corps of Engineers. Stability thresholds for stream restoration materials. So this one's actually cited in a bunch of those other design guidance that I showed you. It's one of the most commonly used, but he really just summarized all the work that's been done, research on plume studies and things, and showed on which different surfaces are stable at different velocities and shear stresses. And so you got a whole long list of different materials and then what the range of velocities that they're stable for. I like the table that they had in there because it shows kind of quickly, you know, on the top there's velocities, and you can see it 0 to 2, and it goes up to over 8 feet per second. And anything in red, that's on a stable material. So that just takes it off the table. If you kind of know where your velocities are in your area, you can kind of quickly filter down your list of available treatment options at a very high level. But this is kind of an example of it. There's actually 2 points I want to make on this. It's kind of how you use the table. If you picked a couple of different, so this would be a coconut fiber, just a erosion control fabric, and you're going to plant it. And so you've got different ranges of velocities for these different materials. And the point I wanted to make here is that you have to look at both the initial post-construction condition. So when it's first built, it's just fabric. And it's smooth and it's not as strong. And so in this first year, 2 years before vegetation is grown, it's just a smooth surface. So when you have higher velocities on that surface, and you have a lower strength because there's no vegetation, there's no rooting, there's nothing. So you need to look at both conditions. So if you're the immediate post-construction, it would fail at 3 to 4 feet per second for this particular one. But in a mature state, it's good 12 feet per second. So it's a big difference, and you need to consider both. Most of these projects are most vulnerable in their first couple of years if you're doing something with vegetation. If it's riprap or vessel, this is a little out of order. I'll pop back to this one. So here would be an example of looking at it. This is site in Northern California. On the left would be what are the initial velocities right after they construct it. So it's smooth, no vegetation growth on it. And you're looking at velocities, and it had color coded. So 16 feet per second was the threshold for this material. It lights up for the initial condition, but once it's mature, you have vegetation and it's slowing the water down. It was fine, but this was a problem we had to deal with. We had to actually just roughen up the channel in this case and slowing it down. The client wasn't comfortable having it vulnerable for a few years. So just make sure you check both initial post construction and then mature state. Even if it's vegetated riprap, still you don't get vegetation on the riprap for a couple of years. So check both. Good one. This is going back to some of the design guidance. Riprap sizing on all these projects, that even if it's a green project, that's green materials, a lot of times you're gonna have a rock toe or some component of rock on the site. And so you can think about what size of rock is stable, This is probably the most common design guidance out there. It's called X23. It's on FHWA. Definitely the most commonly used. It'll help sizing your material and then the gradation of the material. It also does things like if you're putting rock down, you usually have filter material underneath, thicknesses, all that kind of stuff. This is probably the most commonly used guidance for riprap or rock toe or whatever. Talk through a couple different common treatment types. This is vessel, so again, it's fabric encapsulated soil lifts. You can see in the drawing down there, but there you construct a rock toe. And then you basically will do these lifts of soil. So if it's fabric, construct a lift that's 3 to 12 inches typically, can't go much more than 12 inches. And then it wraps over the top. And then you put down a layer, a fresh layer. And then you just do another one on top. And these can be steep, which is one reason they're used often. 1-to-1 is common, and you could go steeper. Rock compared to riprap is more like 1.5, more usually like 2-to-1. So this is nice that you can create a steep camel bank. You do have to irrigate with these, or I would recommend irrigating. If you don't irrigate on these in the first year, you can have survivability problems. You don't have the material that's really creating the strength. So it's the rooting that creates the strength of the bank. But then you've got the vegetation also has an impact on the hydraulics, slowing water velocity down. So it kind of acts in two ways to help the stability, and it slows water down. And the root train is what gives the bank its strength. Good habitat value, very natural banks. In a few years, these things, are hard time calling if it was a constructed site or a natural channel. There's many different versions of this. This one here has a floodplain bench. It could keep going up. You have rip lodge at the bottom, and there's many variations of this. This is just kind of a typical classic example of vessel. You want project examples of vessel, you will see the lifts a little better here, kind of how it's constructed. But by lift, with the cuttings in between. You do have to have available material. You got harvest. If you're doing willows and live stakes, you have to have somewhere nearby, hopefully, to harvest that material. And it can be a lot of material to get thousands of cuttings. You have to have a source. Something to think about. Another example from Yankee Fork, Central Idaho. The picture on the left is initial post-construction, and then the right looks like it's 8 years after. That's us. That's well over 10 feet tall. The stuff grows fast. So what this is also a good example of when you're talking about access. So if this was somewhere you wanted anglers to be able to get down to the water, you pretty much jumped it all out for public access. And on some sites we've done provided access. It could be just a strip, couple of strips to break it up. It could be rock stairs. There could be ways to provide access in this. You just want to be careful of creating these long corridors for boaters to be able to get out, or if you want fishermen to be able to get down to the river. Another example, chump stick. This one was kind of hard to see, but there's a bridge there. Just showing that these can go, you can grow vegetation under bridges if they're tall enough and get enough light. Immediately under the bridge, difficult to get vegetation to grow, but you can do these kind of treatments under bridges if you have enough light. The vegetative riprap option. This is a good resource. This also came from HEC 23. That was the riprap reference that I showed earlier. They do have a lot on vegetative riprap. They have 5 different types. They're just slight variations on themselves and different methods for how you're digging the vegetation through the riprap, the type of vegetation you're using, but they're all pretty similar. The one that's a little different is number 4 on vegetative riprap with soil cover, often known as buried riprap. So you're just putting a blanket of riprap down like normally would, but then you're going to cover it with soil and and grasses, you're gonna have a hard time getting things like trees and shrubs to grow on that, the grasses will grow. Number 5 is more of a, if you've got existing riprap and you're, trying to vegetate existing riprap. Examples of vegetated riprap. It is high strength, probably not as good as Bethel. It's close. Decent habitat value.
Still coming through.
I'm not
Okay.
a biologist, I can't speak too much to the impact on the critters and stuff, but a lot of people that don't like seeing riprap banks for different reasons, but it is long lasting. If you're putting riprap out there, it's legacy material. So if you're in an area that doesn't normally have rock, it will stick out as something to some folks unnatural in that environment. Maintenance can be an issue. These things settle and move around. So you might have to go and change. If it's sloughing and falling into the river, you might need to go and do some maintenance for it. If it's vegetated riprap and you're having a hard time with survivability, you might have to go in and do some plantings. So there's potential for maintenance on vegetated riprap or any riprap. Multiple treatments, I touched on this earlier, if you have a long reach, it's common, you don't have the same hydraulic conditions everywhere. You're not gonna wanna do the same treatment through the whole project. So you might have, say, a couple different approaches, and part of that is probably cost savings as well. So if you're in an area that's a constricted part of the channel, maybe a river bend, you've got your high strength option. If it's a straight reach, lower velocity, maybe that's where you're gonna do something that's lower strength, lower costs, and then it's maybe something that's in between. It is a common approach, just to try and do multiple treatments. They just have to be able to kind of meet up nicely. You can't have radically different geometry, or it's gonna be difficult to tie them all together, and so it just won't look very natural again. Backwater considerations, obviously applicable in the lower basin, it's below the Paldo. There are some considerations when you're going backwater. So normally, free flowing river, you're doing your construction in the summer, fall, that's when water levels are low. Kind of the opposite in lower basin, so those construction issues with having high water when you're doing construction or wanting to do construction, at least until the fall. And also with vegetation, so typically in a free flowing river, you want your vegetation down where we get like the low water level, fall, summer levels, that would be your vegetation layer, because you're going to need to be able to get into the water table. Lower basin, you've got full pool through summer during your construction season, so I don't think you're gonna be able to get vegetation to grow below. Much below that, it depends where you are in the lower basin, but you just can't have survivability if things are underwater. That's gonna be a factor, and it's gonna be site specific where you are in the lower basin. I know there's concerns about boat weight energy. There are, in the design process, you could look at the impact of weights on these surfaces. I think lighting is probably gonna have higher forces, but in the design process, there are methods to look at energy on the bank and see if that's driving it or not. I think flooding is probably gonna drive it, but it's something that could easily be looked at in the design process. Riprap and vessel could both handle both weight energy. I think there's some potential for loss of material. So if you have filter material, fine material, that we can kind of pull that material out. Something we should consider in the process. Design floods, so in Coeur d'Alene Basin, obviously there's different flooding conditions. Often biggest flows are in the spring, but that's also when you have the highest backwater. So I think when you're designing something, you're gonna want to have maybe multiple scenarios where you're looking at high backwater condition, large flood, and then maybe more of a winter condition where it's a flashy flood and the lake levels are low. That might be when you're gonna see your highest velocities. So a little more complicated than just a free flowing river where usually just higher flows, it's the higher velocity. Lower basin requires a little more thought. On that, water challenges, water management during construction could be a challenge in lower basin with high water levels in the summer. Free flowing river, you've got low water levels and better access to the river. That's something that should be considered early. Vegetation considerations. Obviously, a high habitat value, riparian areas are very important part of the ecosystem. So having vegetation on the banks is critical for aquatic species, background bird nets, all that stuff. It provides a couple benefits. Not only provides some strength to the bank, but like I said earlier, it really helps reduce velocity. So it's kind of helping in two ways, as opposed to something like rock, where it's really just a strength component. It doesn't really slow the water down. As I said earlier, it requires irrigation. That's usually put on the contractor through a performance spec where they're required to have some sort of survivability criteria. Might be 1 year, might be 2 years, but it's usually put into the performance specification that they have to have a survivability criteria over a certain amount of time and meeting the methods are fit for them. How do you get water to the side of the trucks? If you don't have access, and you pump from the river. Let's think through how you're going to irrigate that first season, especially. Sources for vegetation, talked about that earlier, make sure you have source. Consider partnering with community stakeholders on vegetation work. That's often done on projects. It could be tribes, could be watershed groups, could be anybody in the community who's could be educational. I see that a lot where it's a good opportunity to engage stakeholders with helping with the vegetation component of the design. And the neat thing if it's possible. Few construction considerations, obviously things like access, workspace, you've got access roads, staging areas, consolidation areas. Sometimes that can be a major constraint. It really depends on the site. Something to think about early, getting that stuff laid out, kind of go factoring how constraints. Carrying management of water can be a big one and should be thought about early, especially if in lower basin. Think about coffer dams. It depends on how far it's going into the channel. If you're talking about just working up above the water, that's fine, but usually we're trying to keep down into the channel toe. And we have to do some coffer damming and diversion of water. That can be a real challenge on some projects. Really site specific, but when you're out there putting coffer dams in, you need to think about risk. If you're going to work through the winter, you got to think about risk. How large are these coffer dams going to be? 5-year event, 10-year event. What happens if it fails? All that stuff. Big component. Often one of the most challenging parts of doing these projects. Management of contaminated sediments. It's always a challenge. Offsite disposal volumes. Now, is there a nearby facility? All that stuff has to be thought out. On-site issues, handling contaminated sediments. If you're gonna have consolidation areas, if you're dealing with saturated soil, they need somewhere to water. Just so you have a space for that. There might be wash stations. You don't want to be driving equipment around, tracking stuff all over the site. So just things to consider on-site management. I think that's it.